What's going on, family? I'm Scrapbook Boxing, Museum of the Forgotten Fisticuffs series. I want to talk to you about a very sensitive topic, and it involved the Black Murderers Row. Now, the Black Murderers Row was divided into three separate eras. Now, the first wave of Black Murderers Row, you had fighters such as Dave Holly and Jack Blackburn, Sam Langford, Joe Jeanette, Sam McVeigh, Harry Wills, Jeff Clark, Zeppelin Ghost, and many, many others. But then you would have the second wave of Black Murderers Row. Those fighters consisted of Kid Norford, Julius Williams, who was Jack McVeigh, Harold Smith, who was Harry Smith, the Harlem Thunderbolt, George Godfrey, who was the Leaperville Shadow, and many, many others, Lee Anderson and Bruce Flowers. But then you had the third Black Murderers Row, and that's what's most familiar to many: Charlie Burley, and Coco Kid, and Holman Williams, Elmer Violent Ray, Jimmy Bivens. You had Lloyd Marshall, and Eddie Booker, Little Tiger, Aaron Wade, Burt Littell. But there were other members that wasn't classified as Black Murderers Row, such as Oakland Billy Smith. You had Charlie Green. And you had some really good fighters that were in the same category of Black Murderers Row. They didn't get their fair shot of opportunities. So let's take a look at the beginning to see exactly what took place. Now, English heavyweights lasted from 1719 to 1885. Your first champion was Jim Figs, and he was champion from 1719 to 1730. Then you had Jim Smith, who was champion from 1885 to 1887. Now, Jim Smith would take on Jake Kilrain. Jake Kilrain was a bare knuckle, a very strong fighter from America. And Jim Smith was a European, started out as light heavyweight, but he would challenge for a very prestigious title. It was newly founded by K. Fox. It was called the Police Gazette Belt. And that fight would take place in 1887. Now, John L. Sullivan was the logical contender because he was the first bare knuckle champion in 1882 when he knocked out Patty Ryan in 9 rounds. That fight took place in Mississippi. But the problem was John O'Sullivan didn't have the backing. He didn't have the $5,000 that you needed as a side bet to participate in that bout. Now, to take it back, boxing began in 1681. And you've never had a black fighter fight in all that time. You did have black slaves that would fight one another, battle royales, and many other unappreciative events. But they were never mainstream. Now, John O'Sullivan would take on Jim Corbett, 1892. September 7th of that year. It would be the first glove bout, and he would be knocked out in 21 rounds. Now, the mistake John O'Sullivan made earlier that year, he did an exhibition with Gentleman Jim Corbett. And in order for Corbett to get the fight with John O'Sullivan, he made it seem as though he was having a lot of problems with John O'Sullivan. Now, John O'Sullivan did wear gloves, but when he was sparring. And the 5-ounce glove would be introduced. And John O'Sullivan couldn't keep up with the wittiness nor the speed of Gentleman Jim Corbett. He would gas out and he'd be stopped in 21 rounds. Now, how Corbett got that opportunity to face John O'Sullivan? He was in a ring with the Black Prince, Peter Jackson, who, by the way, was avoided by John O'Sullivan. And Peter Jackson would take on Jim Corbett. And that fight would last 61 rounds. They would call that fight a no contest, and they would turn it into a draw because they realized that Peter Jackson not only held his own, was in verge of defeating Jim Corbett. But John O'Sullivan, by this point in time, had already drew the color line. And he said he would never face a black fighter. But Peter Jackson would take on Old Chocolate. His name was George Godfrey. That fight would last 19 rounds. And Peter Jackson would become the brand new colored heavyweight champion in boxing history. Now, George Dixon would become the bantamweight champion June 27, 1890, when he would take on Nuke Wallace. He would become the first fighter to win a championship overseas. He would become the first fighter to win any title. He would become in any sport. And he would become the first black fighter to win a title in America. Now, I said a second ago that George Dixon was the first fighter to win a title. He was the first fighter of America to win a title. Now, the first fighters in general were two black fighters. They were the first fighters of America. When you had Bill Richmond and Tom Molyneux. And Tom Molyneux would be the first black fighter and the first fighter of America to fight for a world championship. And it actually wasn't a world championship. It was a championship of England. And that was against Tom Cribb. So then George Dixon would take on Carl McCarthy, and he would become the featherweight champion, March 31st, 1891. Now that Peter Jackson, Jim Corbett fight would take place May 21st, 1891. And like I said, it was 61 round draw. But then in 1804, Bill Richmond. In 1810, Tom Molyneux would take on Tom Cribb. And Tom Molyneux was jobbed in that fight. He had Tom Cribb out on his feet. Tom Cribb was allowed to a cover. And he would defeat Tom Molyneux. May 12th, 1902, Joe Gans would be the first black fighter of America. And he would win the World Lightweight Championship crown. He would defeat Frank Earn. Now, these problems began happening with black fighters as early as Joe Walcott, 1902. But it's just that those fighters had the right managers to give them their opportunities. Joe Gans and Joe Walcott. Jack Johnson was chasing Tommy Burns around. 1908, he would get his shot in Sydney, Australia, and he would become the first black world heavyweight champion. Meanwhile, a member of the first wave of Black Murderers Row, Sam Langford, was trying to get an opportunity himself. In 1903, Jack Root would move up from the middleweight division into the newly developed light heavyweight division, which was designed for him because Sam Langford was going right at Jack Root. And that they didn't want. So they would create the light heavyweight division, and they wouldn't include Sam Langford in that list of fighters. The men who were included in the list of fighters was Charles Kid McCoy and Marvin Hart. Now you had Jack Root take on Charles Kid McCoy, and you had a fighter by the name of George Gardner. He was a very hard puncher. He took on Marvin Hart. And after those two fighters would defeat their prospective opponents, they themselves, Jack Root and George Gardner, would face one another. And the new light heavyweight champion would evolve. And George Gardner would defeat Jack Root. So Sam Langford was sidestepped, and an opportunity was not given to him. He had to take on Joe Gans in 1903. Title wasn't on the line because he didn't make weight. He would defeat Joe Gans, but he would not fight for the title. He would take on the Baltimore Demon, Joe Walcott, in 1904. And many thought he defeated Joe Gans, and they defeated Walcott. But he was not giving a title shot with either one of them because Joe Walcott's title was not on the line, and the fight was a draw for 15 rounds. So Sam Langford would try for the middleweight division. He would take on Stanley Ketchel. Stanley Ketchel's agreement is that title would not be on the line. It would go 6 rounds. But the agreement was that Sam Langford would get a second opportunity to fight Stanley Ketchel and the first opportunity for his title. Unfortunately, Stanley Ketchel would be shot to death by Walter Dipley. And you had many black fighters, such as Jeff Clark, the Joplin Ghost, battling Jim Johnson, Joe Jeanette, and Sam McVeigh. You had Jack Blackburn and Dave Harley. Fast Black, and many, many others would never get that opportunity. And this is when things would get a little sticky and become obvious that the black fighter was not only an avoided fighter, but it was an independent rule that black fighter would never get a shot at a title. It happened in England with Leo Johnson. Len Johnson is the fighter I'm referring to. He was blackballed because he had his rightful space to get a shot at Mickey Walker's middleweight title. And Mickey Walker drew the color line. He said he would never fight a black fighter for the defense of his middleweight championship crown. Len Johnson had to go to Australia just to collect the British Empire middleweight championship title. And Tommy Milliken, who was from Scotland, would get a shot at Mickey Walker. He'd be stopped and knocked out, but he got his shot. Len Johnson would not get the title from his own country, but Tommy Milliken from Scotland would. Now, there were 13 colored middleweight champions. You had 5 colored middleweight title defenses. 2 black heavyweight champions. 4 title defenses. 4 colored light heavyweight champions. 1 title defense. You had 28 colored heavyweight champions. 78 title defenses. You had 18 well-recognized colored heavyweight champions between 1876 in 1937. Charles C. Smith was champion in 1876. And Larry Gans was champion in 1937. Between May 1899 and August 1899, Klondike Jonathan and Frank Childs. Frank Childs was known as the Crafty Texan. And these men will get a title shot for the colored championship belt. Now, after Jack Johnson would become the heavyweight champion in defeating Tommy Burns, he would relinquish his colored heavyweight championship belt, and he would designate Joe Jeanette and Sam McVeigh for that title shot in 1909. And Sam Langford was promised, but never given, a shot at that title. We'd have 13 colored world middleweight champions. You had Harris Black Pearl Martin, May 2nd, 1887. And the last champion would be Coco Kid, January 15th, 1943. And what was interesting about Coco Kid, he would be the first colored welterweight champion when he would defeat young Peter Jackson. And he would become the last colored middleweight champion when he would defeat Holman Williams in 1943. You have 4 colored world welterweight champions. September 26, 1912, Eddie Palmer. And January 11th, 1940, Coco Kid. You had 1 Negro heavyweight champion. That was an actual title. 1880. That would be Johnny the Darky Wizard Banks. You had 1 black middleweight champion, James DeVersey. And the colored world lightweight championship would be Leo Johnson, Nobby Joe Gans, Bobby Dobbs, Harry Cook, and many others. Fast Black and many others. Now, the colored light heavyweight champions took place May 30th, 1921. May 9th, 1922. Lee Anderson and Kid Norfolk would rule those crowns. December 20th, 1921. May 8th, 1923. So, just to give you a perspective of how black fighters in early times were treated and given opportunities. Now, they were not just given those opportunities. It was a lot they had to go through to get those opportunities. And that's why I always say, when you judge a fighter and you judge an era, you have to look at the time the man came. Because when fighters came in the 19th and 20th century, they were under different conditions, different set of circumstances. And what they had to deal with was totally different than what fighters have to deal with today. So you can never make a comparison of fighters of modern time to fighters of yesteryear. You cannot say Floyd Mayweather was the greatest of all times. You cannot say Floyd Mayweather would have defeated this fighter or that fighter because he came in a different time. What he was able to get away with today, he would never get away with at that time. Floyd Mayweather would have had problems with 8-round fighters back in the 40s, in the 20s, the 30s, the 50s. And in previous videos, I gave those examples as to why. Number one, you had more fighters during that time, like him. You had more arenas, more gymnasiums to train in. You would fight several times in a month. The fighters at that time were stronger. They fought harder because in the time that they lived. And Floyd Mayweather had brittle hands, especially when he moved up in weight. And to take on fighters, rugged fighters, to keep him off him, he couldn't survive. And that's just what it is. So you can't make comparisons that way. You have to make the comparison in the era in which the man came. And it wouldn't be fair to Mayweather to do that. And it wouldn't be fair to Ray Robinson to do that in his time with another era. But you can always look at the era in which that man came and judge him based on those terms in comparison with another man's era and what he did in his time. That you can do. So we're looking at fighters such as Archie Moore, who's to your right. And we're looking at Ray Robinson, who was to your left. And these two men were very special in their time. There's no other fighter like Archie Moore. There's no other fighter like Ray Robinson. Because these men controlled their eras at their best in their time. Archie Moore fought from 1933 as far as 1960s. Ray Robinson fought 1940 as a professional, as late as 1965. He was 45 years of age when he retired. Then he would make 2 or 3 more appearances at the age of 50. And that would be it for Ray Robinson. I had the pleasure of meeting Ray Robinson, and I had the pleasure of meeting Archie Moore. Moore 4 times, Robinson twice. And I learned great stories from those two men. And both these men were great fighters during their day. Now, let's take a look at Archie Moore for one moment. He was known as Ancient Archie, or the Old Mongoose. And he was raised out of St. Louis. And he was born December 13th, 1916, in Benoit, Mississippi. Or is that the case? Because no one really knows the birth date of Archie Moore. He began boxing when he was 18. He loved Kid Chocolate, Jack Johnson, and many other past fighters of his time. Now, he died December 9th, 1998 in San Diego, California. Suffered a heart attack. He stood 5'11", had a 75-inch reach. He was a light heavyweight. Fought from 1935 to 1963. 35 as a professional, 33 as an amateur. And what's interesting about Archie Moore, he had 220 total bouts, 186 wins, 23 losses, 132 knockouts. He was stopped 7 times, had 10 draws. And he was in there with so many great fighters. Had 1,472 rounds of boxing. And he would have a 60% KO streak. Archie Moore fought them all. He was in there with Jimmy Bivens, August 22nd, 1945, in Cleveland Stadium. He was in there with Carl Bobo Olsen, 1953. He defeated Randy Turpin, did Carl Bobo Olsen. Carl Bobo Olsen became the middleweight champion when Ray Robinson had retired in 1952, and he fought Randy Turpin. Well, Carl Bobo Olsen would take on Archie Moore in 1955. The same year, he would lose his middleweight championship crown to Ray Robinson. He'd be knocked out by both men. And that's ironic because that's the two men you have in front of you. But Archie Moore would also take on Charlie Burley. He took on Ted Tiger Laurie, Oakland Billy Smith, Little Tiger Aaron Wade, Chuck Higgins, Holman Williams, the Coco Kid, Yvonne Durrell, Young Gene Buffalo, Jimmy Bivens. What a fighter Archie Moore was. I mean, he fought a fighter by the name of Doc Williams and Curtis the Hatchet Man Shepard. He was in there with Sammy Slaughter and Leonard Mallow, Oakland Billy Smith. Oh, what a fight that actually was. And like I said, you can't compare Archie Moore to any other fighter because of the accomplishments he made. He was in there with Big Boy Hughes and Freddie Dixon. Eddie Booker took the California State Middleweight Championship title away from him before Jack Chase did. He was in there with Turkey Thompson and Jack Chase, Johnny Bandit Romero, Shorty Hughes, Little Tiger Aaron Wade, Teddy Uros, Eddie Booker. He would lose his NBA light heavyweight championship strap in 1960. They would take it away from him because of lack of title defenses. 1962, the New York Sack would strip him because he didn't have any title defenses. Archie Moore even faced Muhammad Ali. So again, you cannot compare him to any other fighter. But he didn't get title opportunities until 1952 when he would take on a fighter who avoided him for many years, Joey Maxim. You see, Archie Moore was avoided by Gus Lesnovich. As a middleweight, he was avoided by Tony Zale. He had to take on Charlie Burley 2 different times. He took on Ezzy Charles 3 different times. He was in there with Jimmy Bivens and Oakland Billy Smith, all the great black fighters during his day. But he was never given a title shot. Now, we talked about other fighters on the Museum of the Forgotten Fisticuffs series. But to stay on Archie Moore for one moment. When he fought Ezzy Charles 3 times, fought him in 1946, 47, and 48. Alabama Kid twice, January 10th, 1949, and March 4th, 1949. Howard Johnson 5 times. He won 4 and lost 1 between 1949 and 1954. Charlie Burley 3 times. April 19th, 1948, December 6th, 1949. He actually fought him twice. Jimmy Bivens 5 times. Won 4 and lost 1 between 1945 and 1951. Burt Littell twice. July 14th, 1947 and July 31st, 1950. Jack Chase 6 times. Won 4, 1 draw, and 1 loss between 1942 and 1947. Holman Williams was another fighter that Archie Moore was in the ring with. And Holman Williams was another Black Murderers Row fighter. Holman Williams faced Coco Kid 14 times. Holman Williams lost to Coco Kid 9 times. He defeated him 3 times and they had 2 draw. Holman Williams was in the ring with Charlie Burley, who was another Black Murderers Row fighter. They fought 7 times. William won 3, Burley won 3, and there was 1 draw. And it was ruled as a no contest. Holman Williams was in the ring with Jose Pessoa 6 times. Williams won 2, Pessoa won 3, and there was 1 draw. So just to give you a perspective on how these men fought one another, it was injustice, to say the least. Ezzy Charles would take on Jimmy Bivens, 186 pounds. And Jimmy Bivens was an outstanding fighter. You had fighters such as Lloyd Marshall. And those men were very strong during that time. Lloyd Marshall knocked out Freddie Mills, but he never got a title shot. And Freddie Mills was a light heavyweight champion. and he would defeat Gus Lusnovich. So, this is what happened during that time. Joey Maxim would defeat Freddie Mills, and Archie Moore would defeat Joey Maxim. So I just wanted to go through some information with you, because it's important for you to understand what men had to go through during their era. When you look at Henry Armstrong, he had his battles with Baby Arizmenzi. He had 6 fights with him, 1932, 1939. Between that time, these men would split victories, 3-3, with Henry Armstrong defeating Baby Arizmenzi the last time in 1939. It was a defense of Henry Armstrong's welterweight championship belt. I'm Scrapbook Boxing. Let's go to another video and pick this conversation up. Museum of the Forgotten Fisticuffs series. Now, to give you some stats on some great names and great fighters. Tom Molyneux was known as the Terrible Black. Josh Hudson was known as just Black. Young Kanu was known as Gnarly Black. George Brown was known as Young Molyneux. Gaines was named as simply Black from 1843 to 1844. George Cardhurst was known as the Black. Jimmy Johnson was known as the Blackie. Bob Smith was known as Ebony Young. Bob Traver was known as the Black Wonder. Sam Langford was known as the Boston Tar Baby. Now, you had fighters such as Battling Jim Johnson, who was in the ring with Sam McVeigh 7 times. Harry Wells was in the ring with Sam McVeigh 5 times. Jack Johnson was in the ring with Sam McVeigh 3 times. Jeff Clark and Jack Thompson. Joe Jeanette in the ring with Sam McVeigh 3 times. 1909, alone. You had Bobby Dobbs, who faced fighters such as Joe Gans and George Kid Levine. Black Pearl Harris, George Cole, Black Diamond. They call him Diamond Woodson. Black Frank Taylor, Professor Charles Hadley. These are all great fighters during their day. Now, the second wave of Black Murderers Row was Kid Norford. He was in the ring with Harry Greb twice. Lee Anderson and Jack Blackburn. Jeff Clark and Tiger Flowers. Jamaica Kid. Black Fitzsimmons. George Godfrey. James Tut Johnson. Jackson. Big Bill Tate. Johnny Wilson. Battling Siki. Then you have Harry Smith, who was known as the Harlem Thunderbolt.